Florida law assigns the task of preserving our heritage to the Secretary of State. Here is Bruce Mathers.
My friends, we're about ready to see a documentary report on Florida's historic state capitol in Tallahassee. This film is the result of comprehensive research that accurately portrays the role of our most historic building as the continuing seat and symbol of our government and our people. As one of the 5 oldest Capitol buildings in continuing use in the United States, it traces that heritage from antebellum days to the present.
The sun and wind and water have left their mark on the Florida land. But so have the people who've dwelled here. They have left signs of their values, ideals, hopes, and struggles. Protection and shelter carved from wood and stone. The signs of their faith and strength and gentle stained glass beauty. They wrote their names in the concept of democracy in brick and marble. Structures enduring long beyond the lives of those who built them. For well over 100 years, this building has been Florida's House of State. It faltered and grew, weathered the difficulties and glowed with the triumphs of those who built it and the events that gave it life. It is a diary written in a language that allows us to enter and touch the adventure that is our past. When Spain ceded Florida to the United States, Andrew Jackson became provisional governor. His task was to establish the U.S. system of government and courts in Florida. He inherited 2 capitals, St. Augustine in the east, Pensacola in the west. A maze of Indian trails, a few Indians, a smattering of independent settlers, and no shortage of mosquitoes, sandflies, and yellow fever. It would be fair to say he got out as soon as he could. William Duval identified more closely with the climate and constituents. In 1822, he became the first territorial governor. Legislative sessions were held alternately in 2 capitals that had no adequate roads between them. Travel time was long. A smooth-running government was nearly impossible. At the urging of the legislators, Duval appointed 2 commissioners to find an appropriate spot for a new capital, midway between Pensacola and St. Augustine. After months of travel, the 2 men met in the area known by the Indians as Tallahassee, the Old Town. There, Florida's new seat of government was established. 3 log structures were built to accommodate the council. Settlers came and began to build. Colonel Robert Butler, U.S. Surveyor General for Florida, arrived in Tallahassee and began the survey of public lands. He established base and meridian lines. From the point where they met, all surveys of Florida land would be measured. Colonel Butler planted the new city and named the streets. In November of 1824, the first Legislative Council met in Tallahassee. By 1825, the new capital city had 50 houses, 2 hotels, a school, a Masonic lodge, Methodist church, 7 stores, and plans for a 2-story frame capitol. Colonel Butler won a $100 prize for the design of the new capitol. 1 wing was completed by 1831, but because of legal problems between the contractor and the territory, the building was never finished. This was a period of upheaval in Florida. The Second Seminole War threatened the settlers. Many left. Indian removal was a fierce issue until 1842, when many were forcibly shipped to reservations. Even during the difficulties, Florida determined a solid direction and built for the future. In 1839, the frame capital was demolished to make way for a new and durable capital of brick. The U.S. Congress appropriated $20,000 for a territorial state house. No sooner was the foundation finished when the trouble began. Contract battles prevented the raising of the walls. Lack of money stopped work on the roof. But the legislature moved in anyway. The design was in keeping with the classical tastes of the day. The embryonic capitol was domeless, modest stucco with a look of marble. When finished, government had more room than it could use. And the new capital was ready in plenty of time for Florida to become the 27th star in the American flag. The state's first popular election was held. William D. Moseley was elected governor. The machinery of state government could now begin to operate. The inaugural ceremony was held on the eastern portico of the Capitol. This was to become the traditional place. A state constitution and the Great Seal of Florida were presented for the first time. This was Florida's first unofficial flag. The symbolism is clear. It expressed a feeling in the South, states' rights. The feeling had grown into issues and would soon be a major cause of a civil war. But for now, the days blossomed in the South. Social life and high style graced the state and was especially prominent in Tallahassee. The era left its soft touch on the Capitol. Fancy dress balls in the Hall of Representatives were dazzling, brilliant affairs. The great hurricane of 1851, part of the Capitol's roof was torn off, a foreshadowing of stormy days to come. January 7th, 1861. In Alabama, Jefferson Davis had just been inaugurated President of the Confederacy. Now, secession was the order of business for Florida. Florida's delegates were in convention.
62 ayes, 7 nays.
The ordinance was signed and the seal affixed on the east portico. Little of the joyful celebration remained as years of war crept on. The last days of the Confederacy were trying. Spirits rose and fell with the news from the telegraph office. Florida's House of State was far from most of the fighting, but not untouched by the war. Federal troops were marching toward Tallahassee. Cadets of the West Florida Seminary joined other Confederate forces and met the Union forces at Natural Bridge, just south of Tallahassee. Tallahassee became the only southern capital east of the Mississippi never captured by Union forces. Theatrical benefits were held in the Hall of Representatives to raise money for the Southern cause. This night, the crowd was sprinkled with gray coats and gold braid from the nearby camp, and many of Florida's fairest daughters.
General Lee has surrendered. General Lee surrendered the Northern Virginia Army today at Appomattox.
4 years after secession, Old Glory was raised without ceremony over Florida's House of State. Florida had emerged from the war heavily in debt. A carpetbag administration struggled with the problem. The building, run down, in need of repair, reflected the era through which it had passed. To many, the insult of Reconstruction seemed complete when Harriet Beecher Stowe was invited to the Capitol in 1874. Her warm reception by Tallahassee was unexpected. It seemed to signal an end to the past. The final sign of change came with the return of the Democrats to power. Florida's Confederate battle flags were returned to the state and placed in the Capitol as a memorial to those who had borne them. Florida didn't have a single town at that time that could boast of more than 3,000 people. Only 8 had more than 1,300. The government's fastest means of communication with Key West was by ship from Charleston or St. Mark's. Then an era of rapid change began. A new constitution, more railroads, new people. Things moved forward. The Capitol was remodeled. A cupola and gas lights were added, and newfangled water closets for the accommodation of the legislature. Economic expansion. By the end of the 19th century, government was bursting at the Capitol seams. They needed more room. Over the years, the question of moving the Capitol from Tallahassee had been debated. A referendum finally settled the issue. The Capitol would remain in Tallahassee. The needed space could be provided. Architect F.P. Milburn designed new additions for the north and south ends of the original structure. A dome replaced the cupola. The work was completed in 1902 at a cost of $75,000. Automobiles and improved roads open up the state even more. The first candidate to campaign by motor car wins big. And Governor Sidney Catt's inaugural parade is an uptown celebration. The Capitol Dome gleams in the Florida sun like a beacon. The big Florida boom is on the way. The old building booms with the times. New east and west wings are designed by the noted architect H.J. Clutho of Jacksonville. The building is now more in balance and in keeping with the imposing dome. Electric lights are added to Capitol Square, and the first woman legislator enters the Capitol. But the Florida land boom ended with a terrible bust. The Depression. Lines form in front of the Capitol. People demanding jobs. Governor David Schultz, the New Deal governor, has promised to bring federal programs to Florida. During the Depression, a north wing is added to the Capitol with federal assistance funds, complete with arrows painted on top to point the way for flying machines. During World War II, Florida was a training center. Florida housed the troops coming and going. When the war ends, post-war expansion means new growth for the state and new growth for the Capitol. A south wing is added, and the Capitol is renovated. The executive offices sparkle. The Capitol complex expands. New government buildings spiral up. Then it just seems we outgrew. Instead of enlarging the old Capitol, a new one was built. And contemporary values are written again in the language of architecture. The latest chapter of a diary written in days and events in brick and marble. A place that has reflected the culture and values of Floridians for well over 100 years. That history is culminated with the last legislative session to meet in these chambers. Its important role was always as a part of change, growing in mass with the times, but the essential character remaining the same. Serene, mature, timeless, overseeing the constant growth and change around it. A caretaker of memories whispering, Come inside and touch the adventure that is your past. Now, Florida's symbolic House of State.